Chapter 2. When I had attained the age of 17, my parents resolved that I should become a student in the University of Ingolstadt. I had hitherto attended the schools of Geneva, but my father thought it was necessary, for the completion of my education, that I should be made acquainted with other customs than those of my native country. My departure was therefore fixed at an early date, but before the day resolved upon could arrive, the first misfortune of my life occurred, an omen, as it were, of my future misery. Elizabeth had caught the Scarlet Fever, but her illness was not severe, and she quickly recovered. During her confinement, many arguments had been urged to persuade my mother to refrain from attending upon her. She had at first yielded to our entreaties, but when she heard that her favorite was recovering, she could no longer debar herself from her society, and entered the chamber long before the danger of infection had passed. The consequences of this impudence were fatal. On the third day my mother sickened. Her fever was very malignant, and the looks of her attendants prognosticated the worst events. On her deathbed, the fortitude and her benignity of this admirable woman did not desert her. She joined the hands of Elizabeth and myself. "My children," she said, "my firmest hopes of future happiness are placed on the prospect of your union. This expectation will now be the consolation of your father. Elizabeth, my love, you must supply my place to your younger cousins. Alas, I regret that I am taken from you, and happy and beloved as I have been, it is not hard to quit all of you. But these are not thoughts befitting me. I will endeavor to resign myself cheerfully to death, and will indulge a hope of meeting you in another world." She died calmly, and her countenance expressed affection even in death. I need not describe the feelings of those dearest ties and rents by the irreparable evil, the void that presents itself to the soul, the despair that is exhibited by its countenance. It is so long before the mind can persuade itself that she, whom we saw every day, whose very existence appeared as part of her own, can have departed forever, and that brightness of a beloved eye can have been extinguished, and the sound of a voice so familiar and dear to the ear can be hushed, never more to be heard. These are reflections of the first days, but when the lapse of time proves the reality of evil, and the actual bitterness of grief commences. Yet from whom has not that rude hand rent away the dear connection? And why should I describe the sorrow which I have felt and must feel? The time at length arrives when grief is rather an indulgence than a necessity. The smile that will play upon the lips, although it may be deeming a sacrilege, is not banished. My mother was dead, but she had still duties which ought to be performed. We must continue our course with the rest, and learn to think ourselves fortunate, whilst one remains whom the spoiler has not seized. My journey to Ingolstadt, which had been deferred by these events, was now again determined upon. I obtained from my father a respite of some weeks. This period was spent sadly. My mother's death and my speedy departure depressed our spirits. But Elizabeth endeavored to renew the spirit of the cheerfulness of our little society. Since the death of her aunt, her mind had acquired new firmness and vigor. She determined to fulfill the duties of her greatest exactness, and she felt that the most imperious duty of rendering her uncle and cousins happy was devolved upon her. She consoled me, bemused her uncle, and instructed my brothers, and I never beheld so enchanting at this time, when she was continually endeavoring to contribute to the happiness of others, entirely forgetful of herself. The day of my departure at length arrived. I had taken leave of all my friends, excepting Clerval, who spent the last evening with us. He bitterly lamented that he was unable to accompany me, but his father could not be persuaded to part with him, intending that he should become a partner with him in his business, in compliance with his favorite theory, and learning that superfluous in the commerce of ordinary life. Henry had a refined mind. He had no desire to be idle, and was well pleased to become his father's partner. But he believed that man might become a very good trader, and yet possess a cultivated understanding. We sat late, listening to his complaints, and making many little arrangements of the future. The next morning early I departed. Tears gushed from the eyes of Elizabeth. They proceeded partly from sorrow at my departure, and partly because she reflected the same journey was to have taken place 3 months before, when a mother's blessing would have accompanied me. I threw myself into the chase that was to convey me away, and indulged in the most melancholy reflections. I, who was never to be surrounded by amicable companions, continually engaged in endeavoring to bestow mutual pleasure. I was now alone. In the university, whither I was going, I must form new friends, and be my own protector. My life had hitherto been remarkably secluded and domestic, and this had given me invincible repugnance in new countenances. I loved my brothers, Elizabeth and Clerval. These were old familiar faces, but I believed myself totally unfitted for the company of strangers. Such were my reflections as I commenced my journey. Was that as I proceeded my spirits and hopes rose. I ardently desired the acquisition of knowledge. I had often, when at home, thought it hard to remain during my youth cooped up in one place, and have longed to enter the world, and take my station among the other human beings. Now my desires were complied with, and it would indeed have been folly to repent. I had sufficient leisure for these, and many other reflections during my journey to Ingolstadt, which was long and fatiguing. At length, the high white steeple of the town met my eyes. I alighted, and was conducted to my solitary apartments to spend the evening as I pleased. The next morning I delivered my letters of introduction, and paid a visit to some of the principal professors, and among others to M. Kremke, professor of natural philosophy. He received me with politeness and asked me several questions concerning my progress in the different branches of science pertaining to natural philosophy. I mentioned, it is true, with my fear and trembling, the only authors I had ever read upon those subjects. The professor stared. "Have you," he said, "really spent your time in studying such nonsense?" I replied in the affirmative. "Every minute," continued Mr. Crumpy with warmth. "Every instance that you have wasted on those books is utterly and entirely lost. You have burdened your memory with exploded systems and useless names. Good God! In what desert land have you lived, where no one was kind enough to inform you that these fancies, which you have so greedily imbibed, are 1,000 years old, and as musty as they are ancient? I little expected this enlightened scientific age to find a disciple of Albertus Magnus or Paracelsus. My dear sir, you must begin your studies entirely new." So saying, he stepped aside and wrote down a list of several books treating the natural philosophy, which he desired me to procure, and dismissed me, after mentioning that at the beginning of the following week he intended to commence a course of lectures upon natural philosophy and its general relations, and that M. Waldman, a fellow professor, would lecture upon chemistry in the alternate days he missed. I returned home, not disappointed, for I had long considered those authors useless when the professor had so strongly reprobated. But I did not feel much inclined to study the books which I had procured at his recommendation. M. Kremke was a little squat man with a gruff voice and a repulsive countenance. The teacher, therefore, did not press me in the favor of his doctrine. Besides, I had a contempt for the uses of modern natural philosophy. It was very different when the masters of science sought immortality and power. Such views, although futile, were grand. But now the scene had changed. The ambition of the inquirer seemed to limit itself to the annihilation of those visions in which my interest in science was chiefly founded. I was required to exchange chimeras for boundless grandeur of realities of little work. Such were my reflections during the first 2 or 3 days spent almost in solitude. But as the ensuing week commenced, I thought of the information which M. Kremke had given me concerning the lectures, and although I could not consent to go and hear the little conceited fellow deliver sentences out of the pulpit, I recollected what he had said about M. Waldman, whom I had never seen, as he was hitherto been out of town. Partly from curiosity and partly from idleness, I went to the lecturing room, which M. Waldman entered shortly after. The professor was very unlike his colleague. He appeared to be about 50 years of age, but with the aspect expressive of the greatest benevolence. A few gray hairs covered his temples, but those in the back of his head were nearly black. This person was short, but remarkably erect, and his voice the sweetest I had ever heard. He began his lecture with a recapitulation of the history of chemistry, and the various improvements made by different men of learning, pronouncing with fervor the names of the most distinguished discoverers. Then he took a cursory view of the present state of science, and explained many of its elementary terms. After having made a few proprietary experiments, he concluded with the panegyric of modern chemistry, terms of which I shall never forget. The ancient teachers of the science, he said, promised impossibilities and performed nothing. The modern masters promise very little. They know that the metals cannot be transmuted, and the elixir of life is a chimera. But these philosophers, whose hands seem only make to dabble in dirt, and their eyes to pore with a microscope of crucible, have indeed performed miracles. They penetrate into the recesses of nature, and shew how she works in her hiding places. They ascend into the heavens. They have discovered how the blood circulates, and the nature of the air we breathe. They have acquired new and almost unlimited powers. They can command the thunder of heavens, mimic the earthquake, and even mock the invisible world with its own shadows. I departed highly pleased with this professor and his lecture, and paid him a visit the same evening. His manners in private were even more mild and attractive than in public, for there a certain dignity of his mien during lecture, which in his own house he replaced with the greatest affability and kindness. He heard with attention my little narration concerning my studies, and smiled at the names of Cornelius Agrippa and Paracelsus, but without the contempt that M. Kremke had existed. He said that these were men who were indefatigable. Zeal modern philosophies were inbred from most of the foundations of history. They had left us as an easy task to give them new names, arranged in connected classifications, the facts which they in a great degree had the instrumentation of bringing to light. The labors of men, genius, however, erroneously directed, scarcely ever fall, and ultimately turning into a solid advantage of mankind. I listened to his statement, which was delivered without any presumption or affection, and then added that his lecture had removed my prejudices against modern chemists, and that I, at the same time, requested his advice concerning the books I ought to procure. "I am happy," said M. Waldman, "to have gained a disciple, and if your application equals your inability, I have no doubt of your success. Chemistry is a branch of natural philosophy, which the greatest improvements have been made, and may be made. It is on the account that I have made my particular study. But at the same time I have not neglected the other branches of science. Man would make but a very sorry chemist if he attended to the department of human knowledge alone. If your wish is to become really a man of science and not merely a petty experimentalist, I should advise you to apply to every branch of natural philosophy, including mathematics." Then he took me to his laboratory, and explained to me the uses of various machines, instructing me as to what I ought to procure, and promising me the use of his own. when I should have advanced far enough in science to not derange their mechanism. He also gave me a list of books which I had requested, and I took my leave. Thus ended a day memorable to me. It decided my future destiny.